Welcome to part 6 of Complex Visual Studio Solutions, CRUD operations on data access objects. In this part, I'll be talking again about how to create hand-rolled DAOs using Enterprise Library version 6. In the previous video, part 5, I created the entire logical architecture, which includes the infrastructure layer, data access object layer, business object layer, presentation layer. On the database side of things, I showed you how to drop and create the database using database scripts. I recommend that you internalize that technique of using scripts to create and drop your database because it saves a ton of time, especially when you're doing testing. And if you have an automated build process using continual delivery, right, some process, or continuous integration, CI, it certainly helps because every time you build your project, you can drop the database, create the database, populate it with valid test data, and run all your tests every time you build your project, right? So that's the motivating reason behind learning how to do that. I'm not talking about all this stuff again in this section, or in this particular video, because I want to focus on the data access object layer and particularly the employee DAO and these CRUD operations. We've already seen a query on how to retrieve all the employees from the database. In today's video, I'll show you how to create an employee, retrieve an employee by employee ID or by last name or some type of piece of data, right, that might be unique to the employee, and then how to delete the employee. Okay. Now, in order to understand this material, that is your create, read, update, delete, we're going to be using SQL prepared statements. In order to understand how to create an SQL prepared statement, you'll need to know how to create SQL parameters, how to use SQL parameters to build complex queries, and how to execute prepared statements. Type mapping is an important topic as well, because when you're programming in C# you're using .NET types. When you're building SQL prepared statements, you're using DB types, and these DB types that you use have to map to the SQL server types that are on the tables in your database. The iDataReader methods that appear on the iDataReader object have to map to the types of your fields on your tables. Along the way, I'll be modifying the business object and the presentation layer. I'll be obviously adding code in the console application so we can test, and modifying the BO, the employee BO, to create, retrieve, and delete employee objects. A test layer or a test project is a great place to do this stuff. And creating unit tests is covered, I think, in part 3 of this video series. So I recommend you check that out. So without further delay, let's get coding. And this is not going to be quite as long as video as the previous one, so hang in there. Picking up where we left off from the previous video, we have the project set up, right? I've implemented the DAO, the database has been initialized with the scripts, and when you build the product, or when you build the application, I should say, it executes the code that you see on the screen now and calls get all employees, and here in a second it'll make that call, and we can see that it still works. Takes a little time for it to power up. There we go. So we're just printing out the contents of the data of the employee table, which has been initialized with test data. Okay, so now we can turn our attention to the DAO. Well, let's take a look at the B. So here's the program.cs, our main application. Here's our main method. So we create a business object, the employee BO, and then we just call get all employees here, which returns a list of employee VOs. So here's the employee VO, and here's each VO that gets returned from that list. And since the value object has overridden the toString method, we just call console.writeLine, pass in the object, and this read line is there simply to pause the console so that it doesn't just disappear right away when you execute it in Visual Studio. The business object extends base BO, right? And it simply has a public interface method called getAllEmployees. And it returns a list of employee VOs. That's a generic type. And then whenever we call this method, we create an object DAO, employee DAO object, I should say. And we just return DAO.getAllEmployees. And then for the DAO, we have a couple SQL string constants in order to enable us to formulate that query. The first one is select all columns, okay? And it simply says select. And then by convention, I like to capitalize the SQL so I know what's SQL and what's not. So select all these column names from, and then, so that's just select all column names. Right? So select all columns is the constant, and it selects all the columns in the only one it's not selecting is picture at this point. There's a picture in there. And we'll get to that probably in another video, how to deal with byte arrays and images in a database. And then from this, using this string, we build select all employees. So we say select all columns from table employee. Okay. And there's no filtering, so it's not, there's no where clause in this particular one. And then we scroll down and we see the list, or we say getAllEmployees method, which is public. It returns a list of employee VOs. Here we create the DB command object, and then we pass that command object. Well, let me just say this. We create the DB command object from the database, which is a property in the base DAO. This is a database, right? Saying get SQL string command, select all employees, which is the string constant right there. And then we pass that command object to the getEmployee list. And then these are just private methods. GetEmployee list takes a DB command as an argument. And then we go through the data reader and we create employee VOs for each of the rows that were returned. And then we have another utility method called fillInEmployeeVO, which is a private method down here. It takes the data reader and just goes through each of the different fields and populates it. Okay. So in order to, all right, so now we've seen kind of the brief overview of where we stand. Now, where are we going to make changes in order to implement the remaining CRUD operations? So I'm going to clear this screen down here so it's not too distracting and minimize this a little bit. All right. Let's start with SQL parameters. Now, the way I like to do my SQL parameters is declare them as constants in my class. So I will create the first one here. First off, I'll start with a comment. Let me select the right window here. Okay. So I'll just make a comment here. SQL parameter. Okay. Now these take a little getting used to, but you'll get the swing of it here. So these are private. Const strings. Okay. Now, how do we know what we're going to do? So I'll start with the first one, employee ID. So when you create a prepared statement, you need to be able to pass in information into the prepared statement in order to set the fields that you want to have set in that prepared statement. So for example, if you're doing a query on, get an employee by their employee ID, you need to set the employee ID value. So however you get that employee ID, which the system is going to provide the method somehow, then we need to initialize that prepared statement with this employee ID value. And you formulate string constants, and we'll see this here in a second, these SQL query strings, you use these SQL parameters to build up those query strings. I like to make them constants, right? That way I'm not dealing with these things. So we do ampersand and employee ID. Like that. Okay. Now you could totally put just about anything in here that you wanted to, right? But this is the way I do it. Capitalize the constant, separating each word in the constant or syllable, however we do it, right? Not syllable, but word or element of the constant by an underscore. Okay. And then this is the SQL parameter. Now this differs from a verbatim string. So if you see the @ symbol there, the verbatim strings are formed like this. They start with the @ string, okay, and then they have the quotes. So this would be a verbatim. Okay, string. However you spell verbatim. Okay, so that would be, this is a verbatim string. This with the ampersand inside, or the @ symbol inside the quotes, that's a SQL parameter. Now moving on. Now, how do we know which ones that we're going to need? Well, whenever you're going to need one for each field of the database. So our database, let me move my database a VM over. I've got one of the scripts open. This is the create table script, and it shows the tables and their types, essentially. So we have employee ID, which is an integer, okay, and it's an identity. Now, I'll get back to this here in a bit, okay, but that just means that it's going to be automatically incremented, right, and it's going to be unique value. So it starts off with 1, 2, 3, like that. And then first name, you notice how, and this is important here, employee ID, you see how that's written, right? First name, middle name. Okay, so how you've actually declared your fields is important. And then the type, varchar 50, varchar 50, varchar date time, var binary, which is picture, hire date, and bit. I think I'll go back and add picture to the mix just to make sure that I'm accounting for all the fields. But as far as inserting pictures into the database, I won't do that. Okay, so then we have hire date and is active. So birth date, hire date, is active, and that's just a bit. That's a 1 or a 0. Okay, so anyway, your fields will have to be, eventually you will be dealing with these field names, but I just wanted to take stock of these. If we're going to set these values, if we're going to query for these values, if we're going to set them, then we need to have SQL parameters. So I'll start with I started with employee ID, and I'll copy the rest. I'm going to copy the rest of these. SQL parameters just to save some typing time. Okay, so we have first. So remember, these are just constants for these values. These SQL parameters will be used to create SQL query strings, and to insert data into the database and set your prepared statements. Another way to delineate or group sections of your code is with regions, and I'm a big fan of regions. So I will put, maybe I'll put it underneath. Well, I'll put it right here. I'll start this one. So if I want to group this section of code, right, because I don't necessarily want to always display these things, I like to kind of choke up my code and focus on important areas, I'll put a region. So I'll start this off with the hashtag region, and then space, and then I'll give it a title. So I'll say SQL command parameter. Just like that, SQL, and then at the bottom of this, I'll say end region. And I will repeat this string, just so I know which region is ending there. Okay. So I'll save that. Now, now that you have this region, you can collapse it. So you see this little negative sign over here. So you collapse it. SQL command parameter constants. Bing, boom, bing. Right. So that's I like regions. So now, we have these. Now let's use the employee ID to create an SQL query string. So what we're going to do is, let's do a create employee. So private const string, insert employee equals. So I know we have CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, right? I'll just say, since I'm going to be using an SQL insert command, I like to actually name these constants by the SQL command that I'm using. So if I'm going to select, right, then the constant will start with select, and that's the select. Okay, select all employees. So that constant tells you which SQL command you're using. And since we insert things into a table, I will be using a select command, right, for SQL. So we'll come down here and well, I'll be inserting, right? So I'll be inserting employees into a table. So I'll use the insert SQL command. Insert into. So insert into, oops, let's get the spelling right. Insert into table employee. Oops, that's just like this. Now notice the space here, right? So insert, so I'm building up an SQL command. So insert into tbl underscore employee space concatenation. And then the fields. Let me tab over here just a little bit. So we'll insert first name. So here, this is where the name of your field in your database starts to make is important, right? So you're inserting data into these fields, and I pull my database back over, and we see that the first name, the employee ID field is employee, and then capital I, capital D, right? And then first name is capital F, and then lowercase I, RST, and then capital N, right? So it's case sensitive, is what I'm trying to say. So those are the names of our fields. Oops, I keep on wanting to move that whole window. I'll move my VM back. So that's what we're using here. So first name. So that's, we're going to insert data into first name, middle name, okay, comma, and then last name. Let me select the right window. Comma, birthday, comma, hire date, comma, and then is active. Just like that. Well, let's see, if we create an employee, we'll need a username. Let's go back to the database, make sure we have that. Oh, okay. So, so the reason why, okay, I'm looking at this. This is like create tables. This is in release 1 of the script, right? So, as this database evolved, so this is the initial, right? So here's create table, right? So you notice there's no username here, right? So if I close this and I go to release 2, and it says create tables, probably not there. Release 3, alter table employee. So here's an alter table employee script, and let's see which fields I added. here's where I added username, login hash, and FK user role. Okay, so there is a username field. So you just, the final version of the database. That's why the actual fields or the columns in the database are a summation of all the scripts that have been executed against that database. Okay, I thought I was losing my mind. Okay, so move this database out of the way and get back to coding. So I have is active, and let's do username. Now let's go up to, well, let me make sure that's spelled right. So let me check. I'll pull my database back over here, because this is the important part. User lowercase n. Okay, that's what we're checking for. So username. And of course it was right up here too. All right, so so we're going to insert into employee first name, middle name, last name, birthday, hire date, is active, and username. Now, get rid of that extra space. Okay, now we're going to close this up with a, don't forget the closing parenthesis. Come over here. Okay, now next line. Here's where we have values clause. Now, this is where your SQL parameters come in. So we're going to insert first name. Now you might be asking yourself, well, what about employee ID? Employee ID will be automatically incremented for us, the primary key, because it's an identity. Okay, so if you remember in that create table, there's an identity function, 1, 1. So the number will start off at 1, right? And we already have test data in the database. So whatever the next available primary key value will be, it will automatically be inserted. So we only need to worry about inserting first name, middle name, last name. Okay, so now we need to say plus. Now this first name, right? First name is your SQL constant, or parameter, I should say. So here's first name. This is the actual value that's going to be used, which is this @ first name. Okay, so we come down here. And that's just a placeholder, right, for incoming data into that prepared statement. So plus, and then comma, space, and then plus. Okay, so now I can copy this little section here because I'm going to be repeating that. So first name, middle name. Okay, there we go. And then copy. Last name. Okay, space, copy. And then birthday. Copy. I'm going to return here, space over, and continue with, see, birthday, hire date. Okay, and then copy. And then, so we're going to be inserting hire date, is active, and username. So is active, copy, and then username. Do I not have a username up here? Right, so I need to create another one of these, right? So private. Username. Username equals username, just like that. Okay, so I'll come down here and I'll go username. I have to add the plus sign. Username. Okay, now we're at the end of that, so we have to close this with a parenthesis and a space. Now this is important. You don't want to forget that space. plus, and then one more thing. So the result of this will be the primary key. So in other words, when we insert this, because it's an identity column, the result of inserting this into the database will result in a value being returned to us. So we will do a select scope underscore identity. This is like the secret sauce here. Okay, so now that we have used, so here we have used our parameters, SQL parameters, to build up the insert employee SQL string. Let's create another SQL string to select an employee by employee ID. So let's start off here with a private const string. Select employee by ID equals. Now, so we already have a select all columns, so we'll start off with that. Select all columns, and then from this will be a string. From TBL employee space where. Now we add the where clause. Where employee ID equals, and now we add the employee ID SQL parameter. Just like that. Okay. So now we have two SQL string constants, or query string constants, I should say. One is going to insert data into the employee table, insert an employee, and the other one will select an employee by ID. So we'll go ahead and implement these two methods and then test these out, make sure they work, and if there's any problems, we'll have to iron them out. So now we move into implementing the insert employee. So we'll just come on down here. Here's our constructor. Here's our get all employees. So we can just come underneath of there and go and add another method. So public, this will be a public method, and it will return, if we're going to insert, we will return, the result of inserting an employee will be the employee VO. There's a couple different ways you can implement this. So I'll just say employee VO, okay, which will have its employee ID populated, right? So when we insert the employee, there's no employee ID, but once we insert the employee, we're going to then query the database, grab the employee, okay, and then it will populate the employee ID for us. Well, we'll see what happens here. Okay. So employee VO, insert employee. Now, what do we take here? If we're going to insert the employee, we will take an employee VO. So somewhere in the front end, we're going to populate this employee VO object and pass it into this method. And you can also do another overloaded version. Like, for example, and I won't implement it right away, but we could do something like this. We could say, you could say insert employee, right? But instead of taking an employee VO, you could say string first name. right? String, middle name, et cetera, right? So there's that's the neat thing about hand coding these things, right? And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, that's a lot of work. Well, it is a lot of work up front, but you totally gain a ton of flexibility, right? If you just want to hack something together, generally speaking, you can get to the 80% point fast, right? Or the 90% point fast. But then it's usually a real teeth pulling struggle to get to to close that last 10% gap in your application, because you're fighting with your automatically generated code and your object mapping framework that you're using that is all in XML or some other crazy intermediate language. But once you get these DAOs cranking, then you can go back and start optimizing these DAOs, right? And look for performance enhancements, et cetera, et cetera. So we got insert employee VO. So let's go ahead. And instead of typing all this stuff in, let's go ahead and I'll just copy some code here because, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll start typing some of it. So essentially what I'll do, usually in my methods, I will add a log. And I didn't do it for the get all employees method, but I should, right? So I'll say log info, right? And I'll say usually entering, okay, entering insert employee method with employee, okay, and then I'll put a colon here, and then I'll just go vo.toString employee. Actually, you know what? I'll change this from employee to just vo. Oops, vo right there. So vo.toString. Now, you don't necessarily have to call the toString method here, but I'm just going to do it. All right, so there we go. So these log statements, right? These are very handy, and then you can go into nlog, right, into your config and say, well, I don't want to log info, I just want to log debug, right? So, but this kind of helps for tracing. And then usually whenever we're dealing with like database queries, we need a try block, and then we need a catch. And I'll just catch the general exception. And then, and this will be like a repeating pattern, right? You're going to try to do some stuff with the database inside of the protected area here, and then your catch clause is going to log the error. So it'll be log error, right? And you could elaborate on this, right? So you could say error. Let's take a look here. Okay, so we'll say error getting. I'll say error inserting. All right, employee. Into database. Okay. Plus, let's see here. I think I'll just do E. There we go. So there's our exceptions. I'm just concatenating that message, right? And hit there. I will see if this works, right? Now, once we do the log, and that should be fine. Okay, or instead of, so right here, this would just be catching the exception, right? We really want this exception to propagate up. So I want to kind of handle this exception, and then I want to throw, right? So throw E. I'll just do that, right? I want to propagate this up. All right. Now, generally speaking, I would create custom exceptions to handle these DB exceptions, right? But essentially, this should work. I'm going to grab this exception. If I need to do some, clean up here, log something to the database at the employee DAO level, and then once I handle this exception, I don't want to just eat it down here. I want to let the business object know that there was an exception, etc. Right? And then with testing, unless you completely lose your database, right? If you implement unit tests, right? That's a lot of this stuff is for. You want to test the hell out of it. You want to throw exceptions whenever you can on, conditions that are outside of normal. And then when it comes to actually runtime conditions, things are generally pretty well sorted out by that point, right? But during development, you want to log the heck out of stuff to make it easy to trace. So now let's turn our attention to the try area here and insert the employee. All right. So now the first thing we do is we create the DB command, right? So DB command. And this will be a pattern too. Once you get into the swing of this pattern, we grab the database from the base DAO. Okay, there's the database. Dot get SQL string command. Okay, and so we're using insert employee. So now we have this command. Okay. Now we have to add in the parameters because this insert employee command or this insert employee string has these parameters that need to be set. First name, middle name, last name, birthday, hire date is active username, right? So we come back down here and we simply do database dot add in parameter. Okay, add in parameter. Now we pass the first argument is command, right? Which is this right here. So we pass it in that command object. We pass in the parameter first name. Okay, that's our SQL parameter. We pass in a DB type. A DB type dot string, because that's the name, that's the type of the first name, comma, and then VO. We're going to, now here's where we're going to get the information from, the incoming employee VO object first name, just like that. Okay. Now let's do one more, and then I want to pull over a reference. So database dot add in, okay, command, and then middle name. So that's our parameter, but we've got these things in constants, right? Remember, these are our SQL parameter constants. DB type dot string VO dot middle name. And at some point you can start copying and pasting this stuff, right? So if I just copy this and then come down here, you can't always get away with this, but the only thing that's going to change here is last name, and then you got to change the VO property, last name, right? Okay, and then and I'll go from there. So what I'll do is I'll just pull in the rest instead of making you suffer through me typing everything. So database.addIn parameter, database. All right. Now, alrighty, so We have a birthday, which is a DB type. So here's the differences, right? So these first name, middle name, last name, these are all strings, right? So DB type string, DB type string, DB type string, and of course the VO type is string. So this is a .NET string, .NET string, .NET string type, right? We have date time. So this will be date time, DB date time, okay, and then birthday is your parameter, and then picture is the parameter, and then DB type binary. We're not going to insert pictures, so I'm going to take this out, right? We'll get back to this. I'm not going to pass picture in. All right, so birthday, hire date is active, and then we need one more, so I'm going to I'll paste this one in since it'll be a string. Now, does the order in which you do these things matter? Not really. I'd say no. Okay, but it kind of makes it easier if you keep things in order. Username, DB type string, and then VO dot username. All right. It kind of makes things easier if you keep these things in some type of order. So like the order in which you've declared them, like first name, middle name, last name, birthday, hire date, is active, username, right? The reason why you name, like in the select statement, just as a quick review, you don't do select star, you do employee ID. You name the fields because this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? Now there are techniques that you could use to go in there and get the name of the field that comes back from the database. But I just think that leads to harder to read code. So continuing on, we got username. Now what we have to do is we have to execute this command. So what we're going to do is we have this VO, right? We have this VO coming in. It's got all the information that we need, so we don't necessarily need to go back to the database to get this information, okay? Especially if the command executes successfully. We could go back and actually do a query to make sure that it went in, but for the most part, I would say in situations I'm familiar with, it's going to go in unless some error is thrown during this process. So the way that we set the employee ID is we go vo.employee ID equals convert, and there's a couple different ways to do this. toInt 32, okay, that's a conversion method in .NET database dot execute scalar. So it's an execute scalar, okay, and then the command. And what that results in is that command executes. And then as a result of executing this insert employee command, we're going to execute this piece up here, select scope identity, right? That's going to return the value of the primary key that was created when we inserted that. Okay, we have our catch block. If everything returns fine, if everything executes fine. Now there's a couple different ways to do this. So I will return VO right here. Okay, if we throw an exception with any of this, then we're not going to return a VO, right? We'll just get an exception. Okie dokie. Now, all right, I think we are at the point where we can take this and implement the business object method insert employee and then write some code in the front end and test it and see if we can see data going into the database. Okay, so let's move to the employee business object. Here we are in our employee business object, employee BO. I'm just going to come down underneath of the get all employees method and implement the insert employee. So It will return an employee VO. And I'll say insert employee, and it will take as an argument employee VO, and I'll just say VO. Okay, and I'll just say, then I'm going to create the employee DAO. New employee. And I'll just say return DAO dot insert employee and pass in the VO. So now the result of this will be an exception. So what I'll do is I'll say try. Catch exception E, and a log error, and I'll say I'll just log E at this point. E. Okay. So we need to come down here and add a closing brace. Okay, so obviously the employee business object is not too complicated. But another thing we could do is, like here, right? If you wanted to overload the insert employee method, you could do that here, right? So let me do that, right? So, and then kind of give you an idea of another way to approach this. Let's say we only had one insert employee method in our DAO. We could come down here. I'm just going to copy this because most of the code will be the same. And I'll say, I'm going to create an overloaded method. But instead of passing in the employee VO, I'll pass in string, first name, okay, string, middle name. All right. Let me do it like this so these things don't get too long. Okay, so string middle name, string last name, and then I think it is birthday, so this will be date time, birthday, and then hire date, so date time. Hire date, oops, comma, and then string, username. Well, maybe I'll do Boolean is active and hire date. I'm sorry, username string. Username. Okay. So now here's our arguments: first name, middle name, last name, birthday, hire date, is active, username, and then I will, inside of the body here, I will create new employee VO. Okay. And we'll say there's a default one. And so if you click down here on IntelliSense, you'll see employee ID. So what we'll do is for employee ID, we'll just initialize it to 0, right? And then first name, so first name, comma, middle name. Oh, you know what? We don't have, we haven't got one for gender. I forgot all about gender. I may have to go back. Okay, so first name, middle name, comma. Let's put a space here. First name, middle name. Oops, 0, first name, middle name. And I think I'll start doing this just like the ones above. So tab over here. Make it easier to line them up. Middle name. Okay, last name. Last name. Okay, and then gender, birthday. Let's do this. Since that's the only, I think I'll just do it this way. I'll set what I want to set, since I'm not setting gender in the DAO at this point. I may have to go back and correct that issue. All right, so I'll just say new employee VO. I'll create a default one. And then I'll say VO dot first name equals first name. This is totally another way to do it. First name. VO dot middle name. Middle name. VO dot last name equals last name. VO dot birthday. Birthday. VO dot hire date equals hire date. And VO dot username equals username. Okay. So now that we have that, there's probably a default. I think if I go to the employee VO, it might be a default for gender. So we'll see what happens. Okay. So and then at this point, right, we've got our VO created. So we just are overloading this. Now what we need to do is we have insert employee, employee VO. Okay. So new employee VO. So we go employee DAO, try. Oh, I see what the issue is here, right? So you see how my method is like highlighted. So I think I saw what the issue was. Oh, is active is not being used. So I need to say VO dot is active. Is active. Okay, and let's get this. It says not all code paths return a value. I think maybe I'll set this. I'll go return. I'll say VO equals DAO. Right, so I'm going to set that, pass that in. This will give me the user ID or the employee ID. And then down here, I will return VO. Oops, like that. Because it returns an employee VO. It's looking for that. I'm passing in string values. So this is totally just another way of, you know, overloading ways that you can insert employees into the database when you only have like the DAO insert employee. Okay. So now let's go ahead and save the employee BO. Okay, now here I have the same issue, right? So try, return, catch. Let me move this down here. I'll do the same thing. VO equals DAO and return VO. All right. So let's go ahead and sorry, let's save this employee BO one more time. Now let's turn our attention to the presentation layer and actually test the insert employee method. In our presentation layer now, we've just finished coding up the employee BO. Well, at least we took a stab at it, right? And before I write one line of code in this program class here in the presentation layer, I'm going to compile to make sure, one, I fix all the problems, that if there are any that are in the code at this point, and make sure everything's working before I start hacking away on a test of the insert employee method. So give it a second here while it compiles. We'll see what happens. None of this code's being called at this point, so it might compile fine. But honestly, you want to kind of compile often, right? Because the longer you wait before compiling, the more likely you are to run into issues with the code when you do finally decide to compile, right? So, okay, everything seems to be running fine. That doesn't mean things are going to run great when I actually try to call this method. But all right, so at least we're at a particular point where things are still working. Okay, so let's get going here. So now I'm just going to leave this code in, and I think what I'm going to do is just write, I'm going to say console.writeLine, and then this is when you wish you had Python, right? Where you can say hyphen times 25. All right, so I'm just going to make a line separator here, and I'll say insert employee. I'll do a space. Insert new employee. Okay. So actually, let's run this again and take a look at who the employees are in the database. Okay, so we can pick a new name. So it's compiling one more time and running. And there we go. So so here's the name. Here's the name. I will create a new. All right. I think I'll just make up a name, right? So it's not going to be John Paul Jones. That's for damn sure. All right. So essentially, what I want to do is I want to create an employee VO. New employee VO, and I'll just set, so I'll go in VO.firstName equals, I'll say Laura, and then VO.middlename equals Jean, and then VO.lastName equals Richter. Okay, VO dot birthday. Now here I'm going to have to pause the video for a second and look up how to create a new date time with specific date. So let me do that, and I will be right back. Okay. One thing I noticed when I was looking up this date time stuff was I've already used VO up here. That should be in there, and then new VO. What's the error? Oh, okay. So let's come down here. I'll just do employee. So I'll change this to employee. And then employee. I guess I could have just done E or something. All right, birthday equals new date time, and then it's year. So I'll say I'll make up a year. I don't know when she was born. So 19, probably 65. I'm just guessing here, right? 1965. It doesn't really matter, right? Year, month, and I'll say 6 or 0, maybe 06, and then date 05. Okay, and then employee hire date equals new date time. You know, this stuff, like if you had a graphical user front end, would be done in with a calendar drop down, right? 2020, what's the day? 05, and then 17. Okay, employee is active equals true, and employee dot username equals L Richter. All right, something like that, right? So then once we've done that, we already have this employee business object created, right? Employee BO. So at this point, we just go employee. Now we could put this in a try catch, right? So try, which we should, catch, right? This just so our console doesn't look too hideous, right? So catch exception E, and then log. Well, I'm not extending, right? This does not extend anything. So I will just say console right line E. Well, I'll say problem inserting employee. There we go. Okay, so right here we're just going to say employee BO, employee BO dot insert employee, and then pass in employee. And then we'll check the database at this point. We'll check the database. Alrighty, so let's run. Well, first off, let's check the database here. Let's pull it over. I'm going to pull the database and go. One way to check it, well, if it runs, right? Let's just see here. There's a couple different ways to check this. This is a script. Let me open up SQL Manager. Before I do this, let me make this bigger. You guys are probably wondering, why is that VM so damn small on your screen? All right, let me pull this over this way. One way to check here would be, if this code executes fine, then we just do another one of these. We'll just say for each employee, and we'll print this out again. So I'll stick this code down here, but I'll do this. I'll say console, well, I'll just put a line separator. I'll do /n/n, and I'll just get rid of this. Add a few more of these hyphens. Okay, now let's run this. If we have any problems, it's probably either with not populating all the fields in the employee VO, but I don't think it's anything that we will have too big a problem with. If you do get an error, right, you just go through. It looks like it executed fine. See, look, I'm a chucklehead, right? Because I can never remember / versus \. Let me run that again just to get those irritating things out of there. So this will be \n. \n. All right, so let's run this again. Now we should have Largene Richter in there twice, right? If we're running this thing twice, it'll give us another Largene Richter, right? So we should see that. I don't think there's any unique constraints on anything other than the primary key. Let's see here. Oh, I think I see what's going on here. Right. Okay. So there's the first time I ran it. Well, let's go check out the database. I mean, I'm not seeing an exception. See, because I didn't set right the sex is defaulted to male, right? So that's in there. So let's take a look at the. Let's take a look. Oops, I keep on wanting to move that whole window. Let's look at the database itself. So we'll go to the database and employee training, tables, table employee, and we'll edit the first, I know this is kind of small, top 200 rows. So we do have Largene Richters in there, right? So Largene Richter, date, picture's null. So that all that worked, right? So it inserted it into the database. Okay, so I think at this point I'm just wondering why it's not creating it twice, right? So there should be no constraint on anything. Let's go back here. So if I run this again, I'm going to execute this code, right? So we get this printout, and then we say inserting new employee. Let's go ahead and go \n, \n. Okay, so we create a new employee. And then L Richter's her, right? Let's try this. Employee, this ain't going to make a difference. Dot sex, oh, gender, equals person, VO dot sex dot female. Okay, so we set her gender. But then again, see, we're not setting gender in the DAO, so it really doesn't matter at this point, right? So we have to go back and correct that. But if we just wanted to put that in there, that's not going to make a difference, right? All right, so then we create we do the insert employee, right line, and then we go get all the employees. Okay, so let's run this. All right, so it's compiling. We still only get, so I wonder, let me go check the logs. All right, here's where we go. Oh, let's check the logs, right? So this is not behaving the way I think it should, right? I don't think, as I recall, right, there's anything in the database that's limiting me from putting in more. Obviously, right, we got John Paul Jones, male, John Paul Jones, male, John Paul Jones, male, right? I should see another Largene Richter, right, 52, but I'm only seeing one. So let's go check the logs. Now, how do we check the logs? So we minimize that, or we stop that from running. We minimize Visual Studio, and we go into projects. Okay, we have to go find the logs, right? employee training, Visual Studio solution, and we're running this from the presentation layer, bin, debug, and there's our logs directory. So today is the 17th, so we're going to right click on Notepad++, and we're going to come down here and we see, oh, we do have. All right, so let's try to, looks like there's a few exceptions. So I'm going to I'm going to reduce the size of this a little bit to make it easier to read. So, so we run it. We've database created, employee DAO created, entering insert employee method with employee 0, right? So there's the first attempt. We create it, create the DAO. So that seemed to be fine. The first time we did it, right? We ran it 3 times, right? The first time we did it, we did not get an error. The second time we run it, error data access, inserting into database system SQL exception, the statement has been terminated. Okay, wrap close in action, break connection, SQL data stream. See if we can't find, execute scalar. Okay. All right, I'm going to have to go offline here and see if I can't track this error down. And then once I get this error sorted out, I will get back to you guys. Okay. All right, so this is an easy one. I went to the database, and lo and behold, I have a constraint on username. Right, so if we, I think if we right click and we get the properties, let's just, well, I think what we need to do is go to the script, right? But so the login hash and the username, I believe, are unique, right? So if we go to, if we close this down, so I have dropped and recreated the database, right? You see there's no Laura Jean Richter in there now. This is really reinforcing the script piece, right? It's like, these things are amazing. So let's go into release 3 scripts. So here we go. So I have alter table where I add those new fields. And then I have a unique username constraint SQL. So let's go ahead and edit this. And it says I'm adding a unique constraint. So in other words, the username has to be unique, right? So let's go back and let's modify. So this would have been a good thing for a unit test, right? Is to make sure that we weren't violating that unique constraint, or to test that that constraint was working correctly. All right, so good thing for the logs. The logs showed that we were having an error, so let's pull up Visual Studio. So I think what I'm going to do here is, so I could create, let's say that I wanted to, I'm going to run this one more time, right? So this will give us, if I run this time, it will give me Laura Jean Richter, right? So we're going to run this program. It'll execute, it'll give me that listing, then it'll say, okay, here's Laura Jean Richter, all right? Now I'm not printing out the username in that toString, right? I probably should, but I'm not, right? So I come down. Now, if I modify, if I say the next time through, I go L Richter 1, right? I hit save, and then I execute this again. Okay. Then we'll see 2 Laura Jean Richters in that output. All right, so we'll create a new and there we go. There's our second one, right? Because this one has another username. So you know what I could do is, since I'm not obviously printing out the username, right? I could go ahead and stop this, and I will comment out this code, right? So I'm going to say, let's comment out everything from here. Okay. All the way down to, right. So I'll go ahead and do down to here. Okay. So we're just going to then execute this read line. I mean, we're going to do a listing next time, but I'm going to modify the employee VO. So I'm going to go to the infrastructure layer, the VO. I'm going to open employee VO, go down to the toString method. So what I'm usually doing here is I'm just adding employee ID, base toString, and then plus. I'll do this. I'll do space and then plus username. Okay. Now, when we do the listing, let's go ahead and run this. We will see the username printed out at the end of each of those rows. Okay. So let's run that. All right, takes a bit of time to compile, right? So we should see a listing with usernames, and there we go. So I could go modify this string here, 51 years old, test 5. So here's our username, and Laura Richter, and then Laura Richter 1. Okay, so that was the issue. There was a constraint on you, and you usually do want your usernames to be unique, right? So that's the way the database has been created, and that was the issue. So our insert employee is working, except there's one thing that's kind of bothering me, is I didn't see an output to the console for the error that was thrown when we were trying to insert an employee who already had a username, right? So there should have been an error in the database that was thrown or reported to the console. Okay, so let's go ahead and see if we can't troubleshoot that issue. And then as soon as we get that thing sorted out, then I'm going to call this video, well, I think this video done, right? Because then I'll have another video for the retrieve and follow up some of the other CRUD methods. Okay, so we have, we try to create the employee. We insert the employee, and if there's a problem inserting that employee, this insert employee method in the employee BO should throw an exception, right? So the exception should have been reported. And I didn't see that. So I'm going to run this code one more time. There should be already a Laura Richter 1 in there. Let's go to the employee BO. Let's do this. Control save. Employee BO. So when I try to insert this employee, oh, that's the problem. See this right here? I didn't do throw E, right? So this exception, so this might have thrown the exception, right? That threw the exception and it was caught, but I just logged it and I didn't throw it again. So I had no idea that it was being... you can modify, so right now I'm just relying on the exception to bubble up, right? But I could have logged this to the console, so I could modify, and maybe in the next video I'll show you how to modify log, nlog, to actually have a console logger. Right now I'm just logging to a file. So now if I save this, and I've uncommented this code here, right? So I'm going to create a new employee with a repeating or a non-unique username. Now, when I run this code, I should see the error, and that would make it more clear, right? So like I reiterate, if you have unit tests, this stuff is what you'd be catching in unit tests, right? To make sure that things are all on the up and up and you're ironing out your mistakes and your bugs. But the code is working, seems to be working fine. All right, let's see what I got here. Right, so it printed out, right, so we threw the exception, problem inserting employee, system, let's see what it's saying. The statement has been terminated. Oh yeah, violation of unique key constraint. So if I'd have had that thing throw in that exception, we would have seen the exception in the console, and I wouldn't have tried to run it 3 times, scratching my head like I had no idea what was going on. Okay, so I covered a lot of material in this video. Essentially, the important concepts are: how do you formulate? Let's go back to the DAO. How do you formulate parameters, right? SQL parameters. I use constants, right? I package them up into constants, right? That way I'm not dorking around with them inside the statements per se. And then these are going to map to any field that you're going to insert. I have a picture, but I'm not inserting the picture yet. I'll do that in another video just to show you how to do it. Okay. And then you have your SQL strings, and then if you use if you're going to insert data into a table, right, or you have to have anything where you're passing information into an SQL string, you will then populate your data with these parameters, right? So here I'm inserting into table employee, first name, middle name, last name, birthday, hire date, is active, username, and then first name, middle name, last name, birthday. These are all the parameters that are defined as constants up here. And then when you do create the method that you're going to insert, you need to then create your database command using your SQL string, insert employee in this case, and then you need to populate each of those parameters, or I should say add the parameters. Now I want to show you one thing before I exit, right? And that is the mapping table for .NET types, the DB types, okay, and these methods down here, get int32, get string, etc., right? And let me move this out of the way. Let's go to my hard drive here. I'm going to go to my books, and I'm going to open up C# for artists. So when that opens up, I'll bring over. So this material is found in, a lot of this stuff that I just covered is found in C# for artists, 2nd edition. I'm working on a 3rd edition, not quite finished yet. I'm trying to get that out the door here in the next several months. And down in network and database programming, go to a multi-layered database application. And we're going to come down here to a section on complex queries, SQL command parameters, and prepared statements. Okay. So essentially, these are the steps. Let me make this a little bit bigger. All right. Let me slide this over. Okay. So the generalized steps to using SQL command parameters and prepared statements: you got to define the SQL command parameters, which is what we did here, right? So if we go back here, we defined our SQL command parameters. All right. And then create an SQL command string using the previously defined parameters, which is what we did here, right? So we created this insert string with these command parameters. And then create a DB command object by calling the database get SQL string command, which we did in the insert command, insert employee command, or function, or method, I should say, right? Method. So database.get SQL command. And then back to here, and then set each command parameter value. So we set each command parameter, right? So for the first name, right, et cetera, for whatever you're inserting into the database. And then execute the DB command, calling execute scalar or whatever. There's a couple different ones: execute non-query, execute reader, execute scalar. So for example, up here we called the if we got get employee list, right? We go to the get employee list. It was execute reader, but because we're expecting a return, we're going to call execute scalar in this case, right? Because we're going to get the employee ID. That's going to return the primary key integer. Now, one last thing before we terminate this video and call it a day. The mapping table. So this is in chapter 20, page 619. All right, so here is a table that maps the .NET types, right, like string, with the DB type is ANSI string, right? The SQL type is varchar, okay? And getString is the method for the iDataReader, okay? So binary, right? Boolean. So let's take a look here, right? So if we're inserting the is active, right? That would be DB type Boolean. DB type string, right? Equates to ANSI string. So DB type Boolean, DB type datetime, right? Those equate to let's go datetime. DB type datetime, right? The iDataReader is get datetime. All right. So anyway, there's the mapping table. I find this mapping table quite helpful, and I use it all the time. All right. So anyway, this has been one of the CRUD operations, right? Which was insert employee. So in the next video, I will do get employee by employee ID, delete employee, okay, and maybe one or two more, and kind of flesh out that whole thing. And probably I'll start implementing unit tests again, right? So that makes it easier to test this stuff. And that's all I have. So thank you for joining me for this part 6 of this series, and I'll catch you in the next video.